Welcome to the deep dive. We have got a really fascinating exploration for you today. Our mission is to unpack a single, deeply thought-provoking essay by a writer named Xu Feng.
Yeah, it was written back on June 5, 2023. It is titled The Way of Harmony with Others. And, we have the source material right in front of us.
Right. And our goal today is to kind of extract the core insights and see how this one very specific rule, this rule of yielding, basically completely challenges our modern instincts.
It really does. I mean, the central premise of Xu Feng's text is built around this one idea, which is big boats yield to small boats. Greater individuals yield to lesser ones.
Which, at first glance just sounds like a nice little lesson in manners, right?
Right, but it scales up so dramatically. It goes from basic maritime navigation all the way up to human psychology and, honestly, ultimate spiritual enlightenment.
Yeah, and to really understand just how radical this shift in perspective is, I want to put you in the right headspace.
Yep.
Think about how we typically handle conflict in our daily lives. So picture a scenario where you are driving.
Oh, driving is the perfect example for this.
Right, because you clearly, undeniably have the right of way at an intersection. The light is green, it is your turn, you are moving forward, and then suddenly some guy on a bicycle or a tiny electric scooter just darts right out in front of you.
Totally ignoring the rules of the road.
Exactly. What is your immediate knee-jerk instinct in that exact second?
I mean, for pretty much all of us, the instinct is to assert our right. You hit the brakes to avoid hitting them, obviously, but you probably also honk your horn. You get incredibly frustrated.
You might yell out the window.
Yeah, you probably yell. Because within the established rules of that environment, you are legally and morally in the right, and they are unequivocally in the wrong.
It feels entirely justified because our modern concept of fairness is, well, it is highly binary. I followed the rules, you broke them, therefore I have the right to hold my ground and be angry.
We build our whole sense of justice around who has the right of way.
Yeah.
We like human interactions to be categorized clearly, into correct and incorrect.
Right.
But when we step into Xu Feng's framework, that entire system of who is right is just discarded. He replaces it with a completely different metric for how we should navigate the world.
And if we are going to accept a premise that goes completely against all those modern instincts we just talked about, we have to start where Xu Feng grounds his argument, which is the literal physical laws of the ocean.
Yeah, the literal big boats.
Right. In the text, he points out that when a large vessel and a small boat cross paths, the rule of the sea is that the big boat must take the initiative to yield. Now, why does that happen?
It has absolutely nothing to do with who got to that patch of water first.
Exactly. It is purely about physical vulnerability.
Right. In the event of a collision, the people on a small boat are just at a massively greater risk of catastrophic harm. I mean, the big boat has momentum, mass, armor, is relatively safe.
A collision might result in a scratch on the hull of the big boat, but the small boat could be totally destroyed.
It is entirely destroyed, yeah. So it is a physics equation. The heavier mass inherently carries the burden of avoiding the collision simply because it can survive the impact, whereas the other party cannot.
The physics basically dictate the morality. And Xu Feng applies this exact same logic directly to the roads we drive on every day.
He does. He states that cars should always yield to motorcycles. Motorcycles must yield to bicycles. And bicycles, along with all those other vehicles, must ultimately yield to pedestrians.
Because the stronger and safer party assumes the responsibility.
Exactly. The stronger party assumes the burden.
And this physical dynamic, it makes logical sense. But Xu Feng makes a really significant societal leap here. He does not keep this contained to just vehicles on a road or boats on the water.
No, he maps it straight onto human social structures. He explicitly defines this dynamic, the stronger, safer party yielding to the weaker, vulnerable party, as the core definition of humanitarianism.
So according to the text, what does that look like in society?
Well, in the societal realm, he says the wealthy should yield to the poor. Officials should yield to the public. Celebrities should yield to the common folk. Teachers should yield to students. And this is a big one, doctors should yield to patients.
Okay, I really want to pause and examine the friction of that idea, particularly that last one, doctors yielding to patients. That is a highly complex dynamic.
It really is.
Because if we think about what it actually looks like in practice, a doctor holds all the medical expertise, right? If a patient comes in and they are terrified, they're irrational, maybe they are demanding a treatment that does not make any sense at all. Yielding sounds genuinely dangerous in that context.
Right. How does a doctor yield without compromising care?
Exactly. How does that work?
It is a really critical distinction to make. Wifeng is not suggesting the doctor abandons their medical knowledge or, gives the patient the wrong medicine just to appease them. If we look closely at how he defines humanitarianism, it is a structural obligation of the strong. The doctor is the big boat because they possess the systemic power, the status, and crucially, the health.
Right, they are not the one who is sick.
Exactly. The patient is the small boat because they are sick, scared, and physically vulnerable.
Yeah.
So yielding in this context means yielding the relational space.
So instead of asserting authority or raising their voice or arguing with the irrational patient to prove who is the expert, the doctor just absorbs the patient's panic.
Precisely. The power dynamic itself dictates the obligation to step back emotionally. The doctor does not need to win an ego battle with someone who is suffering.
Wow, okay.
That is true humanitarianism in Xu Feng's view. It is not an extra favor that the strong grant to the weak, like, writing a charity check. It is a fundamental law of harmony built right into the fabric of unequal power.
That is an interesting way to look at our institutions. Translating physical mass into societal authority. You can measure wealth, you can see a political office, you know who holds the medical degree. But Xu Feng moves the argument even further inward, doesn't he?
He really does. He shifts from these visible societal roles into the completely invisible realm of interpersonal power dynamics.
And this is where the text introduces the concepts of greater individuals and lesser individuals, focusing entirely on internal character rather than external status.
Right, and his definitions for these terms are very specific. Greater individuals are described as people with a broad perspective.
Right.
They have a high level of understanding, good manners, deep cultivation, self-restraint, moral integrity, and they are highly empathetic.
And conversely, lesser individuals are defined as narrow-minded, short-sighted, petty, and vengeful. They lack manners, cultivation, and self-restraint.
Fundamentally within this framework, they are unreasonable.
Okay, let me push back on this a little bit, because there is a glaring issue that arises when you start labeling people this way. Isn't it incredibly arrogant to walk around the world categorizing yourself as a greater individual who has to graciously yield to all the lesser people around you?
It definitely sounds that way on the surface.
Yeah, doesn't adopting this mindset just breed a massive superiority complex? It sounds like someone saying, I am so much more evolved than you, so I will just let you win this argument. It comes across as highly condescending.
I totally hear that, and it raises a vital question about the actual intent behind the yielding. If you are yielding just to pat yourself on the back, you are not actually a greater individual.
Right.
And Xu Feng anticipates this exact reaction. To explain the underlying mechanics of why the greater must yield to the lesser without arrogance, he uses an analogy about money. Specifically, he talks about losing 100 yuan.
Let's walk through the mechanics of that 100 yuan analogy just to see how it addresses that arrogance problem.
Sure. So consider what the loss of 100 yuan represents, depending on who actually loses it. If a very wealthy person loses 100 yuan, the impact is virtually zero.
It is pocket change.
Right. They might not even notice it fell out of their wallet.
Yeah.
But if a deeply impoverished person loses that exact same 100 yuan, it could be absolutely devastating.
It could literally mean they and their family go hungry for the day.
Exactly. The objective value of the currency hasn't changed at all, but the impact of losing it is entirely dependent on the financial capacity of the person holding it.
And Xu Feng takes this financial analogy and maps it directly onto our emotional and spiritual capacity.
Precisely. A greater person is not greater because they are fundamentally a superior breed of human. They are greater because their emotional bank account is vast.
Right, because they have a broad perspective.
Yes, and because of that broad perspective, they can absorb the pressure, the frustration, or the perceived loss of an argument with ease. They have the capacity to take the hit.
While the lesser person has a narrow perspective, meaning their emotional bank account is practically empty.
Right. They simply cannot bear that same emotional pressure without breaking, without becoming deeply distressed, or without lashing out vengefully.
This significantly changes the motivation. You aren't yielding because you are being condescending. You are yielding because you recognize that the other person literally lacks the emotional resources to lose.
Yes, exact.
If you crush them in an argument, you haven't just won a debate. You have caused real structural harm to a vulnerable person.
It is rooted in deep compassion. Just like the big boat yields to avoid crushing the small boat, the spiritually rich person yields to avoid bankrupting the spiritually poor person.
That makes a lot of sense, but it raises an important practical question. How does one actually build this massive emotional bank account? Does Wifeng suggest that you have to somehow acquire all this spiritual wealth first as a prerequisite before you can start yielding?
Oh, that is a great question. And the answer is no. That is the core mechanism of cultivation in this philosophy. It is a feedback loop.
A feedback loop.
Yeah, you do not wait until you feel spiritually rich to yield. The act of yielding, especially when your ego is screaming at you to fight back, is the very labor that expands your perspective.
Oh,
Every time you swallow your pride and yield to someone with a narrower view, you are making a deposit into that emotional bank account. You build the capacity by exercising the restraint.
so the spiritual wealth is generated through the friction of yielding when it's difficult.
Yeah.
That explains how Shufeng contrasts the anatomy of an argument between the spiritually rich and the spiritually poor.
It does. The text states that if you are spiritually and emotionally rich, you will always yield to others.
And if you are spiritually poor, you will argue fiercely. You will stand your ground stubbornly, leaving others with no room to maneuver.
Because you fight to the bitter end. Your entire sense of self-worth is riding on this one tiny interaction you literally cannot afford to lose.
And Shufang uses a pretty stark aggressive imagery here to drive this point home. He introduces an analogy that is just impossible to forget.
Oh, the pig analogy.
Yes. He writes, if you see someone endlessly arguing with a pig, there's no need to analyze further. The person who is arguing with the pig shares the pig's consciousness and understanding.
It is so brutal. But it cuts right through all the intellectualizing we tend to do about our disputes. We like to think our arguments are sophisticated, but this image just strips all of that away.
Think about how accurately this maps onto something like an internet comment war.
Oh, completely.
You see a post online, someone has a terrible take, and your immediate thought is, I'm going to logically dismantle this person with facts. So you start typing.
And they reply.
Right, and you reply again. Your heart rate is up, your cortisol is spiking, and suddenly you are 45 comments deep into a thread with a complete stranger at 2 in the morning.
We have all been there.
Exactly. And you probably feel like you are the greater individual dropping knowledge, but looking at this through the lens of the pig analogy, what is actually happening to you?
What is happening is that the very act of engaging in that argument is actively degrading your own consciousness. You cannot maintain the status of a greater individual while fighting in the mud.
Wow.
By jumping into the pen and arguing with the pig, you are demonstrating that your perspective has narrowed to match theirs. You are operating at the exact same level of consciousness.
So it doesn't even matter if your facts are correct. If you engage, you forfeit your big boat status.
That is the critical takeaway. A truly spiritually rich person would have looked at that online comment, recognized the narrow perspective of the other party, realized they had nothing to gain and everything to lose by engaging, and they would have simply yielded.
It would have just closed the app.
Exactly. The fact that you stayed and argued proves you aren't spiritually rich at all. You are just as spiritually impoverished, desperate to defend your fragile ego.
It is a self-fulfilling prophecy. The act of arguing fundamentally makes you the lesser individual.
And Shefeng doesn't just offer this as a piece of practical advice for lowering your blood pressure or avoiding internet trolls. He scales this concept all the way up to the ultimate endpoint of spiritual development.
Right. He elevates the act of yielding into an absolute cosmic law.
He really does. We need to look closely at how absolute he makes this rule. He transitions from worldly interactions into a strict spiritual cosmology.
The text states unequivocally that celestials and Buddhas always yield to others and never engage in arguments.
I really want to emphasize the absolute nature of that claim. He writes that anyone who argues with others is certainly not a celestial or a Buddha. They are a mortal. They are a worldly person bound entirely by worldly ego.
So yielding is the definitive, undeniable proof of being a sage, a celestial, or a Buddha.
Yes.
Okay, let's slow down and grapple with the historical and practical implications of a rule that strict. Because my immediate reaction is, well, what about activists? What about civil rights leaders? Or anyone throughout history who has fought against genuine oppression? Are people who engage in a heated debate for a just cause considered spiritually poor? How does Wufeng reconcile the need for societal progress with this absolute mandate that you must never argue?
That is exactly where this philosophy becomes deeply uncomfortable for a modern audience. And the reality is, within the strict framework of this text, Feng does not offer a loophole for righteous arguments.
Wait, there is no exception for a good cause.
No. To understand why, you have to look at the difference between worldly justice and spiritual divinity in his cosmology. A civil rights leader fighting for justice is doing necessary, important work in the worldly realm.
Okay.
But the mechanism of argument, even for a noble cause, still anchors you to that worldly realm. It requires you to push back, to assert force, and to engage in conflict.
So you are still bound by the rules of the ego.
Exactly. In Feng's framework, divinity is not about achieving worldly justice. Divinity is about total detachment from ego and absolute compassion. The very nature of argument, regardless of the topic, is seen as a failure of that ultimate boundless compassion.
So if you are fighting for a cause, you might be doing good in society, but you are confirming you are still immortal. You are still playing by the rules of the physical world.
Precisely. If yielding is the ultimate expression of spiritual wealth, then every time we feel the urge to stubbornly stand our ground, even when we believe we are absolutely right, we are being presented with a test of our emotional bank account.
Divinity is found exclusively in the capacity to absorb the hit.
Yes.
So whether we are looking at the literal mass of a cargo ship on the ocean, or the systemic authority of a doctor in a hospital, or the emotional resilience of a sage, Feng is giving us one unified theory.
True power is demonstrated not by force, but by the capacity to yield without breaking. The stronger party always assumes the burden of harmony.
It is a complete inversion of how we typically measure strength. It challenges the very foundation of how we perceive conflict.
It really does.
So we want to challenge you, listening to this right now, to put this unified theory to the test in your own life.
Oh, this is a great exercise.
The very next time you feel that heat rising in your chest, the next time you feel the urge to stubbornly stand your ground in a petty dispute, whether it is at the grocery store, in a meeting, or in the comment section online, just pause.
Ask yourself, am I the big boat in this moment?
Right. Do I have the emotional bank account to absorb this? Can I afford to yield? See what happens to the dynamic and to your own state of mind when you simply refuse to push back.
But as you ponder applying that to your own life, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought based on the absolute nature of Feng's rules.
Ooh, okay, what is it?
Well, what happens when the absolute rules collide?
I see where you were going.
We know from the text that a worldly person argues, and a celestial or a Buddha always yields. They never argue. But what happens in a hypothetical situation where two celestials, or two completely spiritually rich individuals, cross paths and happen to disagree on a course of action?
Oh, wow. If the absolute rule is that a celestial must yield, and neither is allowed to assert their point of view over the other, what does that interaction actually look like?
Exactly. If both parties are entirely committed to yielding to the other, does their interaction become this beautiful, endless, intricate dance of mutual accommodation, where they are constantly offering the right of way to each other?
Or, practically speaking, does progress simply come to a grinding halt because no one is willing to take the lead and assert a direction?
Right. It is a fascinating paradox of ultimate harmony for you to mull over.
The paradox of the endless dance. That is a brilliant thought experiment to leave off on. We want to thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the sources today. It has been an absolute pleasure unpacking the mechanics of these ideas with you. We hope you walk away with a slightly different perspective the next time someone cuts you off at an intersection. Until next time, take care, and remember to watch out for the small boats.